You're inside Utah Valley University's packed auditorium when chaos erupts. Shots ring out in the middle of Charlie Kirk's speech, and panic spreads instantly through the crowd. People duck, chairs slam against the floor, and students scramble toward the exits in disbelief at what they're hearing. Within seconds, Kirk collapses on stage, the conservative activist struck by gunfire at point-blank range. But the horror of that moment has now turned into outrage, because the shooting has raised serious questions about how security at a high-profile political event could fail so catastrophically. Kirk wasn't an unknown figure. He was one of the most polarizing voices in American politics, drawing passionate supporters and fierce critics everywhere he went. Security experts say that should have made him a top-risk individual, someone who required layers of protection, controlled entry, perimeter sweeps, and close-range detail inside the venue. Instead, investigators now confirm the shooter fired from a nearby building overlooking the event, a vantage point that should never have been left unsecured. The scene outside tells the story of that failure. Police swarm the perimeter, sirens echoing against the campus walls, while students who attended the event gather in shock. They ask the same question reporters are pressing authorities on. How could a gunman get into position and fire multiple shots before anyone intervened? Even more alarming, the suspect slipped away in the chaos, evading law enforcement despite hundreds of officers converging on the scene within minutes. The silence inside the courtroom where these details were later presented was telling. Every fact released so far points to one truth. Kirk's death may not have been preventable, but the glaring lapses in preparation gave the shooter an opportunity that should never have existed. And now the debate is unavoidable. If a political figure this controversial can be gunned down at a university event without adequate protection, what does that say about security for public figures across the country? As investigators retrace the steps of that night, the details of the security setup at Utah Valley University are drawing heavy criticism. Event organizers had expected a large turnout, and local police were stationed inside the auditorium. But experts now say the measures in place fell short of what should have been standard for someone as polarizing as Charlie Kirk. The first glaring flaw was perimeter control. Reports confirm that buildings surrounding the auditorium were never locked down or monitored, even though they offered clear sightlines into the event space. From one of those elevated positions, the shooter found an unobstructed view of the stage, a vulnerability security planners failed to anticipate. Second, access screening at the auditorium itself was minimal. Attendees were not subjected to bag checks or metal detectors, even though prior Turning Point USA events had occasionally seen protests and threats. That lack of screening left organizers blind to what was coming through the doors. Third, the absence of a dedicated close protection detail for Kirk is being called a fatal mistake. Unlike top-level politicians who travel with private security or federal protection, Kirk's team relied mostly on campus officers and volunteers. That left him exposed during the most critical moments. Witnesses say it took several minutes for officers to respond once shots were fired, precious time that could have been the difference between life and death. In the aftermath, law enforcement officials admit that staffing levels were stretched thin, with some officers covering traffic and others monitoring crowd flow outside instead of securing high-risk entry points. Critics argue that this was less an unforeseeable tragedy and more a systemic breakdown in planning, one that left glaring blind spots a determined shooter could exploit. And now the question being asked by students, parents, and political figures alike is simple. If such obvious vulnerabilities could be overlooked at a university hosting one of the nation's most controversial voices, how many other public venues are just as unprepared for the unthinkable? Even as the nation processed the shock of Charlie Kirk's death, outrage deepened when officials revealed the shooter had escaped. Witnesses inside the auditorium said they heard the shots, saw Kirk collapse, and expected officers to immediately close in. But the chaos worked in the gunman's favor. With hundreds of students rushing out and sirens flooding the campus, the shooter slipped away before law enforcement could seal off the scene. Authorities later confirmed that an initial suspect was detained, but within hours he was cleared and released, a mistake that underscored how unprepared security teams were for a coordinated response. The actual gunman remains at large, with investigators only now piecing together fragments of surveillance footage, shell casings, and witness statements. Each update highlights just how quickly he vanished, despite the heavy police presence. The manhunt has since expanded beyond campus, with local officers joined by state authorities and federal agents. Helicopters scanned the hills surrounding Utah Valley University late into the night, and roadblocks were set up across the county. Still, no arrests have been made. For critics, this represents another failure layered on top of the initial security lapse. Not only was the event left vulnerable, but the suspect managed to walk away from the crime scene unchallenged. The effect has been chilling. Students who attended the event now speak of a lingering fear, knowing the shooter has not been caught. Families of attendees question whether they can trust campus security at any public gathering. and political observers warn that the failure to apprehend the gunman quickly risks fueling even more division and speculation about how such a high-profile killing could happen without resolution. And now the question weighs heavily. If law enforcement can lose track of a suspect in an attack this public, what confidence can the public have that justice will be delivered at all? Inside the auditorium, the moments after the gunfire were filled with terror and disbelief. Students who had come expecting a heated political speech instead found themselves crouched behind chairs, pressed against walls, or sprinting toward the exits as echoes of the shots reverberated through the hall. Some described the sound as fireworks at first, only realizing what had happened when they saw Kirk collapse on stage. Others admitted they froze, unable to process that violence had erupted in a setting meant for debate, not bloodshed. Faculty members who were present rushed to usher attendees toward side doors. Witnesses recall professors shouting for calm, while others shielded students with their own bodies. In the chaos, some were trampled as crowds surged through narrow hallways, desperate to escape. Outside, the confusion was no less intense. Hundreds of people spilled onto the campus lawns, many still clutching their phones, recording or calling loved ones in tears. For Kirk's supporters, the shock turned almost instantly into grief. His name was being chanted by some in the crowd, even as paramedics fought to stabilize him on stage. Others wept openly, saying they had come to hear him speak on freedom and individual rights, never imagining they would witness his final moments. Opponents of his politics, who had gathered outside in protest earlier that evening, were equally stunned. Their chants fell silent as word spread that he had been fatally shot. The auditorium remains sealed off as a crime scene, but those who were inside say the images will never leave them. The sound of chairs crashing, the sight of Kirk motionless under the lights, and the overwhelming sense that the place they thought was safe had been anything but. And now the question for those who lived through it is whether campuses, designed to foster dialogue and learning, are becoming the new front lines of America's political violence. As news of Charlie Kirk's death spread, the reaction was swift and emotional. Vigils formed outside Utah Valley University within hours, with candles and handwritten signs placed along the campus lawn. Students who had attended the event returned quietly to leave flowers, while others stood in clusters, still processing the fact that they had witnessed a shooting on their own grounds. Parents arrived to pick up their children, some in tears, shaken that a university event had ended in violence. Across the country, communities that had hosted Kirk in the past expressed a mix of sorrow and alarm. His speaking tours had always drawn passionate crowds, both for and against him, but they had rarely turned violent. The sudden escalation left many questioning whether public figures, regardless of ideology, could safely appear at open forums anymore. For some, the shooting confirmed their fear that civil disagreements were giving way to something far more dangerous. Local residents voiced frustration at what they saw as a catastrophic failure of planning. Many demanded answers from university officials and law enforcement about why the event lacked stronger security measures, especially when Kirk's profile and polarizing reputation made him an obvious target. Parents of students who had attended were especially vocal, saying they expected more protection in a space meant for learning and discussion. The outrage reflects more than grief. It reflects a growing unease about whether any public gathering can be considered safe. What was once a political rally became a crime scene, and what was supposed to be a night of debate became a moment that exposed deep vulnerabilities in how such events are secured. And now people are left asking, if a university campus can't guarantee safety during a high-profile event, what does that mean for the future of public dialogue in America? In the days following the shooting, Utah Valley University has struggled to return to normal. Classes resumed under heavy police presence, with officers patrolling hallways and checkpoints added at major entrances. Yet the atmosphere remains tense. Students admit they feel uneasy walking into lecture halls, glancing toward doors and windows, wondering if the same vulnerabilities that allowed the gunman to strike still exist. Professors too have voiced their discomfort, some questioning whether the school can continue to host large public events without sweeping changes to security protocols. Parents of students have become some of the loudest voices demanding accountability. Many sent their children to the university believing it to be a safe environment for learning, only to watch them flee from a crime scene broadcast across national news. At community meetings, parents asked why the auditorium lacked bag checks, why nearby rooftops weren't secured, and why no rapid response team was stationed inside a venue hosting a figure known to draw heated reactions. For them, these failures represent more than poor planning. They represent a betrayal of trust. University officials have pledged reforms, announcing a full review of safety procedures and consultations with security experts. But critics say these promises came too late, after a preventable tragedy had already unfolded. Students who once saw their campus as a neutral space for education now describe it as a place marked by fear, forever linked to the sound of gunfire that claimed a life in front of them. The ripple effect has spread to other colleges as well, with administrators across the country reassessing whether they can safely host public figures without risking the same outcome. What happened at Utah Valley University has become a wake-up call. If security gaps this large can exist in one auditorium, they can exist anywhere. And now the uneasy question lingers. Will campuses remain places for open debate, or will fear and vulnerability force them to close their doors to the very conversations they were built to host? The killing of Charlie Kirk has left more than a crime scene behind. It has left a lasting scar on a community and a country already uneasy about public safety. What should have been a routine event, an evening of speech and debate at Utah Valley University, is now remembered as the night when a figure at the center of national attention was gunned down in front of hundreds. The images of chaos, the unanswered questions about planning, and the glaring security lapses have turned grief into outrage. Every detail revealed since has pointed to the same conclusion. This tragedy was not only the result of a shooter's intent, but also the consequence of vulnerabilities that never should have existed. Unsecured rooftops, minimal screening, and the absence of a close protection detail combined to create an opening that a determined attacker could exploit. And when the shots were fired, the suspect escaped, a second failure that left students, parents, and faculty questioning whether law enforcement was prepared for the unthinkable. In the aftermath, vigils and protests have merged into one message: this cannot happen again. Yet the reality remains that college campuses, once trusted as safe spaces for education and discussion, now feel fragile. Across the country, universities are reassessing their ability to protect students and guests, and communities are left wondering if public dialogue itself has become too dangerous to continue without fear. Charlie Kirk's death will be remembered as a moment that forced institutions to confront hard truths about security and responsibility. But for those who were in that auditorium, it will also forever be the night when safety shattered in an instant. And now the final question falls to you. If even a high-profile event at a major university can end in such failure, what will it take to ensure that tragedy does not become the price of public speech in America?